fan lloc per seure, moltes gràcies. Nos vamos sentando, muchas gracias. Va. Què tal? Hola, com es diu vostè? Esther, com estàs? D'on vens?
Hi, Esther, how are you? You can sit wherever you like, Esther. This gentleman's from Mexico. That's free, Esther. It's quite an open congress. No problem. Please, would you kindly take your seats? I've got to be strict now, because we're a little bit behind. This is the situation. Some people are always late. This lady, who is called Eulalia Quintodon. Has the mayor left? Okay. Plachadaro. They're not listening. Plachadaro, Casteldaro, and Sagaro. And previously I said something else, and you said no. Where's the other place? I said something else. Daro. Santa Cristina Daro. That's it. Did you know that? Plachadaro, Casteldaro, Sagaro. That's the municipality. Did you know that? Barbara, did you know that? Where are you from, Barbara? and he has been greatly involved in debates and pedagogical events from France. He's a professor in education sciences at the Lumière Lyon 2 University, where he's carried out intense research into education philosophy. And our moderator, Esther Bonal, is the director of Chamfra, a music center in Raval, and she's a teacher at SMOC, the Catalan music school. Esther has lengthy experience in the education sector and dealing with vulnerable people in Barcelona. And she's been working on culture, education, and equity in various sectors. So without further ado, let's start. Thank you very much, Pep. Well, good morning to all of you. I won't introduce Marina and Philippe because Pep has just done that. But what I would like to do is give you a brief introduction and also say that we totally understand the claims being made in this country with regard to education, healthcare, libraries. We stand with these people, with these demands, and this Congress, well, there are lines of people who are eminent in terms of their fight and their stance with regard to educational rights, freedom, and the fight against inequality. Personally, I think that yesterday they shifted the focus. I think they got it wrong. The focus of their demands should have been a different one. We're really sorry about what happened. Right, without further ado, before asking the first question, I wanted to explain 2 points. When Albert said to me, well, he didn't ask, he told me, you are going to moderate the dialogue with Marina and Philippe, and I was really nervous about it. First, because these are people I read, I follow their activities, I see them at conferences. I've had the opportunity to become friends with Marina, and Philippe was my guru. But also, Philippe, as one of my gurus, introduced me to Pilar Figueras. Pilar Figueras, as you're aware, well, when I was 5, she had me singing. She was the director of children's choirs. And when I decided to get involved in education, she gave me one of her works, Frankenstein Educator, and one of his works, rather, and I found out all kinds of things through that. And Marina gave me first A Common World. She published a number of different works, and I got so enthusiastic, and people who know me know I'm pretty enthusiastic, so I do all kinds of things. Catalans do things. I'm a Catalan who does things. And Marina, I wrote to her and I wondered if she could post something on social networks because I wanted all educators in the world to read her work. And through that, we became great friends. We've got 2 eminent personalities here with us, and so we'll start with the first question, which has a great deal to do with what happened yesterday and what's happening currently in Catalonia. When we talk about educating for democracy, Philippe and Marina, through their works, have focused on that. In cities that we say are or want to be educating cities, but at least in Catalonia, there are families with children who don't have access, or there are education policies that that involve police coming into the schools and teachers who are striking. And there are all kinds of paradigms that are alien to what should happen at school. And these are having an impact on education. So what can education do? And what can it not do on its own? Philippe, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. First of all, I'd like to pay tribute to Pilar Figueras, who I knew, and she played a very important role in the movement that you embody today. Now, what can education do for democracy is a very broad, important question. I'd like to say first that education isn't only school. School is, of course, fundamental. It's essential. That's where almost all children spend a significant period of their lives. Schools have to exercise their mission, and I'd like to show solidarity with the colleagues who demonstrated today and yesterday. But school isn't enough. I'd like to focus on the complementarity between family education and school education, and education that takes place outside school, in cities and in the association fabric. Now, experience shows that many children and adolescents who have taken on responsibilities as adults, that have become involved in the various trade union sectors and association sectors, have learned things that they didn't learn at school, but in these associations. So it's important to remember this, because the cities that you represent can be extremely effective. What can schools, in a situation that's been recalled, which is extremely difficult today, how can a school embody this ideal of emancipation and solidarity? Well, it can ensure that individuals aren't closed in on themselves, but that they meet other people. If I could send out only a single message to those of you who want an educating city, is to make your cities the cities of meeting points between generations, social classes, cultures, so that everybody can discover new horizons, that they're not closed in on themselves, on what they've built. Meeting so that people can form bonds of solidarity, so that each individual in the city is somebody who has resources for others and people who need others, organizing society, the social fabric, to ensure that some people's resources meet other people's needs. And I think that's what cities can do, or can at least undertake to do. Many people have resources that they're not even aware of. And I think they should be allowed to demonstrate or show what they have, and show that they can provide resources and help people. Therefore, I think that they can succeed in establishing ties of solidarity. There we go. We can't do everything. Education can't do everything. It can't change the world alone, but it can do a great deal. It can enable individuals to meet, to discover themselves, and that's already a great deal, and that's what you do in the cities that you represent. Thank you very much. Marina, what would you add to that? Well, yes, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Those of you who have come from far-flung corners of the world to think about how our cities and towns can form part of this educational challenge, this network of people and knowledge and movements. As Esther was saying at the start, this is a rather empty room, and it's a reason to be concerned about what we do with our battles or our struggles. against specific enemies, but also we need to think about alliances, and that's what I've always sought to do, to establish alliances through philosophy and also through activism and social movements. First of all, I'd like to greet all of you and all of the people out on the streets defending schools, libraries, and healthcare, because they're not fighting only for a decent wage, as the media are trying to stir up problems, but they're fighting for public services. And these aren't just state tools. No, they're the guarantee that everything we say about democracy and sometimes people are misleading, trying to protect certain political opinions. Democracy is good public services for everybody, wherever they come from, however old they are, whatever abilities and capacities they have. This needs to be quality. These need to be qualitative democratic services. And without these public services, well, we've been seeing these being broken down for years. And we just can't be using empty words. We need to do things. Having said that, sorry, I can hear myself booming on the microphone. When I wrote Escola d'Aprenents, School for Learners, the whole way of understanding education and thinking, I had three beliefs. The first of which was that any kind of educational crisis is not only a pedagogical crisis between pedagogical models, but it's a political crisis, it's a social crisis, it's a global crisis. And the world isn't just the planet. The world is what brings us together. And when these ties are eroded, which is precisely what we're seeing today in terms of struggles and fights, it's not just a problem, but it's a breakdown between interlocutors in a society through what people learn from one another. That's when we can talk about an educational crisis, a real crisis. And we've been facing such a crisis for years in the education sector here in Europe and throughout the world. So that's what I wanted to talk about in my work. The idea is not to close in on our own problems, but we need to ensure that everybody is concerned about common life, because we've got lots of things in common that we can support. The second belief is that we can't talk about education in the third person. Philosophy, and this is my sphere, the philosophy of education from its origins, dating back to the Greek philosophers, but all of these histories or myths are a way of dealing with educational problems in the third problem: how to teach others, how to teach children, how to teach young people, how to teach citizens. And the person asking the question, the legislator, the educator, is outside the question. So how to educate the other? For me, the second belief, and I think educating cities should think about that, is not to use the third person, how to educate others, but to talk about how we want to be educated. Move on to the second person plural, how we want to be educated. So this does become a cultural, political, and social question. But who are we? We have to learn from others. How do we close learning off within and outside school? As Philippe was saying, school isn't the only educational source in our society. So we need to use that first person plural. And then the third belief: there's no education without alliances, no emancipating education without alliances. We know that there are partners, interlocutors in business, but who are our real partners? That's the question. Who are our partners? And when I told Esther that I would come to this meeting, it was that idea, exploring, looking for complicity, thinking about who we don't know, who form part of our common lives, our common worlds, and who we can meet. through our learning and our struggles. So it's an alliance of learners. So that's what I'd think about. There's no educating city without alliances between learners, whatever the conflict, whatever the prospect, the outlook, whatever the beliefs. All alliances start with that possibility of meeting others with that common objective. Thank you. Terms have come up: independence, space, meeting points, connection, the need to preserve and maintain public services, solidarity. When I listened to Philippe, I was thinking about something we've shared with Begoña Roman on occasions. Those calls, the cries of the French Revolution: freedom, equality, fraternity. Begoña always says that fraternity is what we've most forgotten about, that ability, that capacity to listen, to generate alliances. Let's move on to a second question. We're talking about critical thinking, one of the themes of this event. Critical thinking. We think about educating ourselves or training in critical thinking in a context, in a world in which there is so much information, often manipulated. Social networks are all over the place. How do we educate people in critical thinking today? Well, perhaps before I respond to you, I'd like to pick up on what Marina said earlier. Education can't be the first person plural. It's us. We structure educating cities in terms of what changes, thinking about people giving and taking, giving people in the cities a status that enables them to be those who give to others and who can receive from others. And I think that is the role of a city. It's giving everybody that trust that enables them to contribute something, know-how, competence, culture to their peers, and also agreeing to receive, because people aren't all-powerful. So creating that fundamental solidarity. But as Marina pointed out, that means that we need to believe in education. And I'm extremely concerned today because I see that throughout the world, there are a number of people who govern no longer believe in education. They believe in repression, exclusion, the strength of weapons and violence, but not education and prevention. You spoke about the French Revolution. Thank you for doing so. The French Revolution was part of that movement of light, meaning that everybody could be educated, everybody should be involved. Nobody should be left out of that human circle. And I think that the world has been progressing for a number of years. But today, when we see these populist movements in particular, we see a number of countries in the world. And my country is also involved in that. They exclude people rather than moving towards them, rather than accompanying them along a path that will enable them to discover themselves and stand in solidarity with others. Now, responding to the question on critical thinking, you're right. The world we live in is a world in which certitude, clashing against people using phones, portable phones, machines, slogans. What education can do there is get individuals searching. John Newey explained that at the heart of pedagogy, as at the heart of democracy, is that quest, the procedure of searching, encouraging people to continue to want to learn and not to just be satisfied with knowledge coming from AI and machines. I've thought for a long time that students at school want to learn. I'm not sure that that's true. They want to know, and sometimes they want to know without learning. And our role as adults is to enable them to want to learn and not only know, not just to be satisfied with the certitudes that accost them, but they want to find out more and learn more. And I think that critical thinking is applicable to all moments. It's at the heart of the city, the school, the family. Every time an adult accompanies a child and says, go further, let's go further together. Let's not be satisfied with what we thought we knew, with this representation, with the slogans that assail us, the publicity that is pushing us to consume. Let's go further. Let's seek together. And I think adults have a huge responsibility because they have to convey to their children not only knowledge, not only competences and skills, but they need to ensure that they're demanding, that they're seeking, that they want, they desire. And it's that relationship that we need to think about. We need to do it ourselves, and we need to convey that to our children. I think that critical thinking is not just pedagogical or educational tools. It's a relationship with the world, questioning the world, never being satisfied with simplifications, with slogans that simplify that world, that turn it into a caricature and assail it with certitudes that lead to violence. So yes, schools have a responsibility, families have a responsibility, but cities as well have a responsibility. They enable people to come together, to meet one another, and together to search, to seek, in spite of our differences, age differences, differences in terms of origin, concern, profession, all together to seek solutions, local solutions today, but also more global solutions to ensure that our world can stay on course, so that individuals get together to seek, to quest, that they give themselves a common focus. There, I think that we can access that critical thinking that you were talking about.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm taking notes. Right. Off you go. I fully agree with everything that Philippe said, but I would like to add a couple of points. I think that often we've had an abstract idea of critical thinking, and I know that abstraction is necessary and good, taking things out, understanding things. We need to be able to move, otherwise we wouldn't ever be looking for anything or searching for anything. But I'm talking about abstraction in terms of conditions, material, symbolic, institutional, that make it possible for us to move, as many of you come from different corners of the world. Last week, in this country, since we're talking about critical thinking and therefore conditions for emancipation, the age of emancipation in terms of being able to leave the home for young people who are no longer young people in Spain. Now, the age is 34.2 years. That's the age of emancipation today in Spain. Now, what's happening? How are we thinking? Because we're thinking about life, work, who you're living with. We're talking about how to live in a way that doesn't limit you. With all of these restrictions, even in one's private life, we're saying that at that age, and you can work it out mathematically, we're talking about violence, war, an attack on the lives of people. Now, when philosophers, teachers, pedagogues, and often politicians in their talks on critical thinking, emancipation, well, we need to understand what those concepts mean today. How do you teach critical thinking? Well, you need to understand all of that. You need to learn to understand all of that so that it's possible to dismantle, attack, and build different relations. Not talking about the fight for housing, the fight for education, the problem of reading. All of these problems are not separate, because if we separate them, then we'll all be acting in isolation. It's not about what we think about things. We need to be able to change the way we look at things when we're talking to other people, but when we're in confrontation or when we're with other people. So understanding and learning about critical thinking is knowing our place and being able to relate to all of these dimensions, not to feel impotent, but the contrary. And if we want to continue to talk about critical thinking, what's the emotional state dominating practically all spheres? Impotence and fear. Who has fed all of that? How have we been impregnated with impotence and fear in the classroom, in the streets, in the home, in the bedroom? Well, fear and impotence they don't fall from the sky. They are fed by that huge industry of fear, which is so profitable, which makes us easier to govern. It isolates us, it weakens us, and at the end of the day, these lives that are fragmented and isolated are unable to be free. And they end up being those proto-fascists and those individuals who are resentful, and they end up attacking us. And then we blame them. Young people on the right, they don't want to work with us. So how do we get here? I think that's the function of critical thinking. That's what we need to do before we come up with all kinds of abstract views on the world.
Philippe, posso fazer alguma cosa?
Thank you, Philippe. Would you like to add a few comments? Of course, feel free to applaud.
Oui, moi,
Well, thank you. Like Marina, I think emancipation can't be split up into different parts. It's global. It affects an individual as a whole. But today, the challenge for those who want to strike out on their own is a refusal of all forms of enclosure, essentialization. And today, that's something that concerns me. Getting boxed up in your origins, in your sense of belonging, in tunnels of algorithms through social networks, which always show you what you've already picked in the past, and to a somewhat obsessive level, they lock you into who you already are. Emancipation, etymologically speaking, means being able to leave behind what we had. We're not forced to be stuck in what we did in the past. We can change tacks. We can be different. And to be different, we need to understand our environment, our entourage, the various stimulations we have. We need to understand culture, various ways of expressing ourselves. Expressing culture, that's maybe the most symbolic way of doing things, but also artisanship, craftsmanship, culture in terms of everything that makes up human relationships. So chopping up these differences, rather discovering these differences, makes us richer. And emancipation is tied, as you very legitimately said, to human dignity and to our daily human lives, having decent health, housing, and social welfare conditions. But dignity can't be assigned. We can't assign people or children to certain categories. In France, we hear, well, this child is dyslexic. Sure, they might be dyslexic, but that's not all that there is to them. right? They might love manga, and that brings them skills. They might be great at playing soccer, and I don't want to just box them in as dyslexic. I don't have a right to box people in based on this. Rather, it's my responsibility to allow these individuals to discover new boundaries, to move beyond and select what they want to do in their lives. And I think you, as cities, have a key responsibility to open up these people's lives, to provide opportunities, to provide understanding, to provide opportunities to discover new things beyond where we come from, so that we can choose where we are going moving forward.
Je suis hyperactif.
I'm a bit hyperactive, but I hadn't really. I was hyperactive before that was even a thing, before that term or that label existed. And I really appreciate that Philippe pointed out that we shouldn't be boxing people in, we shouldn't just be labeling them. As I was listening to you, I thought of Marcuse's idea that there's a tension between the security human beings need and the freedom human beings need. This tension arises because we have this need to have identities, these very polarized, belligerent, fascist attitudes, which are tied to closed communities. That's what you were talking about, boxing people in, closing and excluding others. That's what's generated by this. So picking up on this idea, when we take a deep look at ourselves in the mirror and identify the contradictions that we have within ourselves, we say, well, we want to work for emancipation, for freedom, but in our schools, universities, our city councils, the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of hierarchy, there's a lot of layers, there's a lot of boxing us in. We still have time, right? Great. So, how do we find this middle ground? How do we find the gaps to overcome these challenges? Two things. The flip side of this fear, this powerlessness that we talk about, which is so generalized, is that often bodies that have a structure, institutions, organizations, where do they stand against this backdrop of fear and powerlessness? Not just in terms of their identity, but how do they defend their values? One thing I'm concerned about, alongside many things that Philippe Meirieu pointed out, is this feeling that the environments we're in, places where those in power, and we all have power in some settings, well, those in power tend to be more and more defensive. The words might be right. I don't want to judge their intentions, whether they're good intentions or bad intentions, but this closing in, this looking inwards, is about not being questioned, not being judged for their work not being up to par. And at the end of the day, it might lead to a worsening. We have various types of situations that exclude people, that are exclusionary, that have to do with the work you do without questioning what you do. We can't talk about democracy, critical thinking, and educating cities in settings that are becoming more and more isolated, where we're isolated from one another. So can we stop being so defensive? And if so, what would happen? Maybe we wouldn't love what we do, who we are, the public face we put on, but can self-criticism go hand in hand with this? That's not something we should take as a fault. I mean, we come from Catholic societies, religious societies, whether or not we're particularly tied to our religion, but we shouldn't feel like we should be blamed for schools that can't do their jobs. We shouldn't be blamed because we're activists or intellectuals. Sometimes it feels like we're just repeating empty words, and at the end of the day, this blame means we're looking for people to blame. In other words, if you're blamed, if there's this culture of blame, well, often at the end of the day, it's young people that are getting blamed. And one of these gaps, one of these areas we can work on is not blaming our young people. They're not just victims. They're not just people who should be blamed for the ills of our times. Philippe Meirieu brought up an example of what happens in our schools when we're slapping labels on people. And that's what we have in schools, children who are labeled or criminalized. And if you haven't been labeled or you haven't been deemed a criminal, well, maybe that seems a bit out of place, a bit anomalous. If you haven't been labeled in some way as a potential criminal across all types of criminalism, right, danger and so on, and if you haven't been diagnosed with something, well, that's a problem. And so I would suggest that we break down this approach. Let's not use these labels all the time, because that is indeed a reflection of our fears. These teachers who need to have a diagnosis for the students so that they can overcome their own teaching difficulties. That means our society doesn't want to look at the ills of our time. The only way we do that is through control, police, social oversight, even where I work at the university. Universities try to roll out a whole range of so-called scientific tools to keep tabs on society. We've got all these technologies cropping up, and all of these systems are trying to sort of slap a bandage on all of these little wounds or gaps that are opening up, and that puts us all on the defensive. You know, picking up on what you said, one thing Philippe wrote was that education is art because it helps us manage what's unforeseen. And in a world where there's so much of a desire for oversight and monitoring and control, maybe there's less space for education. I'm not sure. Philippe, what do you think? That is possible. I think education, indeed, means supporting freedom. We live in a world where supporting freedom is unfortunately more of a danger than an opportunity, and that might be the problem. The problem here is that our institutions often have these so-called values. They might be honorable, acceptable, even excellent, beautiful values, but in practice, the implementation isn't always in line with the values enshrined therein. I think a militant in any field is somebody who wants to act coherently, stitching a link between values and practice. And that's not easy because institutions tend to have generous, highfalutin projects, but then they don't actually roll them out. They act counter to them. Now, you in educational settings, you might be wondering, why don't you do what you say? Why don't you set up schools that truly promote autonomy and independence? Why in cities can people not come together? Why are they stuck in their neighborhoods and their cultures and their jobs? Why? And you find these problems in society, these values that aren't fully respected. We've got scapegoats, basically, as you said. Scapegoats who might be held responsible for our own blame, our own blameworthiness. So similarly, I would say that in order to move towards dialogue, towards encounters, we need to accept that there's a value in debate between citizens, between individuals. And one thing that concerns me is what's happening today worldwide. It's a kind of backsliding. Each and every one of you knows that our students will move from body skills, muscular skills, to linguistic skills. That's around the age of 2 to 3. So early on, students know how to pick up an object, play with it, throw it around, and so on. But later on, around 2, 3, they know how to talk about this object, give it a name, and enter into contact, a relationship with the world through language. Well, today, the highest level heads of state are slipping from this linguistic skill to this body language. from the ability of language and dialogue to strike up relationships with other people, to force violence, to clashing with others. And I think one of the biggest challenges that education faces today is ensuring we have access to words, ensuring each and every child, and this is emancipation itself, can find the ability to speak to others, to turn words into a tool of battle, but battle we wage for fraternity. You're here today because you talk. You go home and you try to create places where people can enter into dialogue, can reflect together, can debate together, who can leave behind these boxes and clashes and labels, this confrontation, and can move towards speaking. I think one of the biggest challenges our civilizations face today is finding a way to not be in conflict, but to be able to speak to one another.
Acabem.
So, to wrap things up, I just wanted to end with a question. Both Philippe and Marina said that talking about values and dialogue and what we're doing in our different educational policy spaces and educational schools, pedagogical spaces, wherever we are in the world of education, when we're trying to find the links between these areas, sort of picking up on this idea of emancipation, my question is as follows. Do we stand ready to take on the risk of identifying these gaps? We ourselves can free ourselves from what ties us to our institutions far too often, to find these gaps in our institutions so that we can change things, move things in a world that, as Philippe said, is backsliding, a world that's turning against us. Now, Albert, I think we had an hour. We've only been going for 40 minutes. So a huge round of applause for both Marina and Philippe. If I may, I'd like to give each of them the opportunity to share some closing remarks. I know we're running a bit late, so we'll just ask each of our speakers to share one final comment. Thank you very much. I hope you found this dialogue just as interesting as I did. Just one sentence. Well, one important value, picking up on everything we said, is that gaps, educational militants, our commitment to this open collective conversation can only be based on gratitude. And I just wanted to end with this gratitude, giving thanks. That's what ensures that we don't stand alone, facing off against the world, our institutions, our very powerful, strong leaders, these all-powerful bodies. We're the result of all of the battles that were waged before us, here in our home and in other places across the globe. So we owe our gratitude to those who made it possible for us to be who we are, and it falls to us to continue our conversations, to continue our battles, to continue opening up our squares and our streets so that we can continue to forge partnerships of learners who will continue to wage this battle. Thank you. Many educators I meet are feeling really discouraged today. Many teachers, social workers, and others working in hospitals, for example, are discouraged. And that's because in our countries, Western countries, so-called developed countries, well, these human jobs have been underestimated. And in terms of being discouraged, I'd like to tell everyone who works in education that we don't have the right to be discouraged. As Gramsci said, the pessimism of reason, we must maintain the optimism of will. In education, we know full well that if we look at our history, a single word, a single action can change a human being. and a single human being can change the world. So everything is possible, even in the greatest moments of challenge when we're feeling incredibly discouraged. Let's stand in solidarity. Let's recognize, picking up on what you said, Marina, our gratitude. Let's always have the courage to educate. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Moltes gràcies, Marina i Philippe.
Thank you, Marina and Philippe. We'll now move to the next dialogue. Thank you very much.
Molt bé. Moltes gràcies. Bé,
Thank you. Without really taking much of a break, we've just got 3 minutes to set up the microphones for the second set of speakers for our next dialogue, so please stay in your seats. Just 3 minutes. Now, in the meantime, I'd like to tell you one thing. After this, we'll have our workshops. They'll be here in the same room. And
Good morning to all of you. We're going to be starting the next session, seeking to find out a bit more about the idea of community. I think that an extremely complex idea in the current day. I like to say that the times we're living in are sometimes the economy, global policy are taking place in conflict with life itself, a huge environment, social and political crisis. In our view, this is sometimes built with the idea of a human being who is far from what human beings really are. As human beings, we belong to a part of life involving plants, animals, air, earth, water that interact, generating their own conditions of existence. And as human beings, we're vulnerable. We're unable to live alone. What I'm trying to say is that human life is independent. It can't prosper alone, though. Therefore, it's structurally a community-based life. And to talk about community, we have two people who I believe are key and also present differing but complementary outlooks. Eliane Brum, she's a journalist, a columnist, and a documentarian with a great deal of international renown, and she carries out investigative journalism, which I think is really an educating task. She's the co-founder of Souleymane. It's a platform that I think has to be followed. And she has written a book which I think is extremely important based on the Amazon, and we are very lucky to have her with us. Then we have Souleymane Bachir. He's a philosopher, a university teacher, the director of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Columbia in New York, and an international eminence in post-colonial studies. I think that in Souleymane's work, something that strikes me as being extremely important is that interconnection between different disciplines that in some way make it possible to have a more complex, holistic idea of the world that we're living in and how we can develop within that world. I'd like to start by asking both of you the same question, if I may. From your point of view, given your experience and your careers, what is community and what conflicts are communities experiencing currently?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And I want to express my love to the idea of combating the precariousness of public education here. I hope that we can build bridges. Let me tell you about myself. I come from the Amazon rainforest, my home by choice. And when thinking about what a city is and what a community is, I would like to think with you about what a forest is, or any biome, any enclave of nature that still resists in this world that has been waging a war against nature for more than 500 years. I suspect that when the non-indigenous majority hears the word forest or Amazon, they think of a place full of trees with animals inside. But that's not a forest. That's a zoological garden, a zoo. The forest, just like any other biome, is a relationship with, a relationship of, everyone with everyone, a relationship of exchange, contagion, devouring, collaboration, interdependence. When the possibility of relationship is exterminated, the forest is exterminated. And when the possibility of relationship is exterminated, life itself is exterminated. And what is a city? One of our cities, those where we are born and make our lives, keeping in mind the differences between them. Our cities are places of extermination of relationships and therefore of extermination of life. To deepen this deadly dynamic, we need to look at how our cities have treated the other. what we call peripheries, is full of other humans like us here who have less right to the city and fewer rights overall than those who are considered full citizens. This inequality is intersected by markers of race, gender, class, and disability. In our cities, the majority are those who have the least right to the city, to choices about what city we want to build, who have the fewest rights as citizens. But it is in these peripheries that technologies of resistance and communities of existence have been created. Centrality is already in the peripheries because they are what move our cities in various ways. But this real centrality is ignored and displaced so that power remains with the minority. Without recognizing with public policies and instruments of real decision-making power where the real centers of our cities are, we will continue reproducing inequalities and blocking any possibility of community. For community to exist, we need to have a sharing of power with those who have been systematically emptied of it. In Brazil, where I'm from, Black people. In the United States, immigrants. In Europe, immigrants and also refugees, among many others. Without sharing power, there is no community. Thus, whoever holds power needs to understand that they're going to have to lose part of their power. Everything else is just empty talk. But what I want to bring to you here today is a reflection on the place we give to other species. A crucial theme for our cities and our communities that is frequently ignored or stamped out. Our cities expelled all the others who are not humans like us. We appropriated large swathes of the planet and expelled everyone. What we accept as non-humans like us are cats and dogs. Well-treated domestic slaves, most of the time very loved, yes, but no less slaves for that. We take them for walks and to defecate on their collars, on their leashes. Cockroaches, mosquitoes, flies, rats, we see them as persistent, harmful invaders we need to eliminate. On our supermarket shelves, we have animals converted into commodities, depersonalized in a long and violent process that reduces them to mere animal protein. We have plants enslaved in monocultures, beings once alive that upon being reduced to products were objectified. Beneath our feet, we frequently have buried rivers, entombed in concrete. Our cars cross perforated mountains, devastated bodies. This violent experience of the city, taken as totalizing and universal, but which is nowhere near totalizing and universal, is determined by the deliberate misconception at the genesis of capitalism, which is the separation of man, and the gender here is intentional, from nature. This deliberate misconception that allows nature to be treated as an other and not as ourselves, nature as a body commodity, a body object for violation, destruction, and the extraction of more commodities. The arbitrary separation of humans like us from nature is what brings us today to the collapse of climate, of biodiversity, to global warming, to extreme weather events, and finally, to the very real possibility of extinction. Our cities consolidated and expanded over the last centuries based on the logic of separation of nature as an other to be domesticated, subverted, or else eliminated. Thus, our cities are places where every relationship with the web of life is eliminated for being considered subversive, dangerous. The movement of capitalism is precisely the elimination of these relationships, and therefore the impossibility of making real communities, which is very different from consumer associations. To make real communities, we need to understand ourselves as interdependent beings. We need to be open to others, to the experience that is the other, both the other human like us and the non-human other, as is the case with other beings. To make real communities, it is also necessary to understand oneself as a relationship. If nature, the forest, life is defined by relationships, then we too, we humans in the room here today, are relationships, even though we sometimes forget it. We're not, for example, a body with bacteria inside. We're also bacteria, which changes our entire perspective. Nature is set apart as an other that is not us precisely because it destroys the idea of the individual within capitalism, a logical impossibility that, upon being imposed, progressively led us to the impossibility of community. And what I want to call your attention to here today is that this is our experience of the city. But we need to remember that other humans created different experiences. The new archaeology of the Amazon showed that before the European invasion of what they would call America, there were cities in the forest with more than 1 million people. These cities did not destroy the forest because they were also the forest. They were cities where nature, and therefore relationships, were what founded and moved them. The ancestors of the current indigenous people of the Amazon, who have been in the forest for at least 13,000 years, shaped the forest in their relationships with all others. To be better understood, Amazonian archaeologists speak of garden cities, and scientists who study the creation of landscapes say that it is proven that the ancestors of current indigenous people planted part of the current forest. In both cases, what we're talking about is a relational movement. It is in relationships that all of this was constituted, and it is with the arrival of the Europeans, followed by local extractivist elites shaped by the same arbitrary logic of nature as an object at the service of man, that all of this is destroyed, just as the bodies of humans who did not separate themselves from nature, those we call indigenous, are continuously exterminated. This widely majoritarian logic has already brought parts of the Amazon to the point of no return and will probably bring the entire forest to the point where it will cease to be a forest in the coming years, which will greatly make any possibility of controlling global warming difficult. So, when we talk about educating cities, what comes to my body is the need to uneducate ourselves from our deadly education as being separated from nature, to uneducate ourselves from an existence mediated by consumption and not by the relationships of interdependence among the living. Our cities need to be radically recreated for us to have any chance of making real communities. Our cities need to open up to the other, to all others, and not just to humans like us. And that means radically changing the way we eat, inhabit, dress, and primarily the way we understand what we are and what others are. In binary thinking, in the thinking that separates humans from nature, in the thinking that places humans like us at the center, any action that reproduces this logic will be merely illusory. To change cities, to be capable of making community, we need to break with this false separation from nature and return to understanding ourselves as nature, and therefore as a being in relationship with. I know that perhaps by this point many of you are thinking I'm out of touch with reality, caught in this hegemonic discourse that changing so radically is impossible. But what I want to say to you, and I come from one of the front lines of the war waged against nature to say this, is that we are at a risk of extinction exactly because of this type of thinking. We will only have one chance, and our children, grandchildren will only have one chance of living on a planet less than hostile to humans like us if we radically change the way we understand ourselves and the other. It fell to these imperfect generations of adults, our generations, the most difficult task in human history on this planet, which is to stop the world devourers, people like Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and so many others, to stop the shareholders of large fossil fuel corporations. It fell to our generations shaped by consumption to reweave our relationship with life and with the living, returning to understanding ourselves as nature, which is what we effectively are, and thus existing in relationship with all the other beings that share this planet. And it is in this spirit that around the world, citizens fight, for example, to unearth rivers and break dams. It's not that we have a choice. We don't. Either we radically change, or we will bequeath death to our children and the children of all others. the movement to return to weaving the web of life with all others is not madness. It's crystal clear thinking. Thank you very much.
Souleymane?
Merci infiniment.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say I'm extremely honored and delighted to have been invited and to be able to find out about this Association of Educating Cities. I'm honored. I'm delighted to share my thoughts with a panel such as this one, with you. First of all, I'm going to answer directly the question you answered, which is what is a community? And then I'm going to try to explain what I want to respond. If I were to give you a single sentence response, it would be a community is the movement of making humanity together. And now I hope that what I'm going to say is going to explain my response. First of all, we know that the question of community in the world in which we live appears something somewhat incongruous. We live in a world in which community doesn't seem to make much sense. We live in a world which today is characterized by fragmentation and by identitarianism and nationalism. Therefore, there's not only these identitarianism that break us up, but also the most violent translation of those wars with all of the atrocities that are carried out. And we really wonder if the notion of war, the notion of right to war, makes sense. Therefore, the world in which we live appears to be making the question of community somewhat utopic. But to continue along those lines, what is this fragmented world? It's not just a state that we will see. It's forces of fragmentation. The reason for which the world we're living in today, our world, just bears the name world, because to have a world, you need a sense of world, a sense of what humanity together means. And so these forces of fragmentation today, we need to be able to identify them, particularly with regard to the underlying philosophy. I come from a country, I'm Senegalese, but I'm also American and I live in the USA. And I note that the world in which I live, the world in the USA today, is seeing a number of strange publications that seek to oppose that idea of empathy. We live in a world in which evolutionary psychologists have written works against empathy with an idea that would appear to be defensible. When I show empathy, I am invaded by such and such emotion, such and such desire to put myself in someone's shoes, and I might lose all rational ability to analyze things and take the necessary decisions in an analytical fashion. So what also happens is that forces from the right and the far right are using the human notion, or they're against the human notion of empathy, compassion, solidarity, fraternity. And they're saying that all that is a weakness. We saw a billionaire, probably the richest billionaire in the world today, state that empathy is the greatest weakness in Western civilization. So look what we have to do to deal with this fragmented world, which is ours today. The idea that you need to oppose, not only live in that fragmentation, where capitalism is satisfied to ensure the flow of finance, we could be in total dispersion. But the idea itself that what opens people up to others, what makes our cultures and civilizations able to open up and not to be closed in on themselves, as the two previous speakers in the previous panel said, speaking about closing oneself off. We see that human cultures are islands, isolated. They're immeasurable. We are fatally tribes and different nations, and those differences separate us. Consequently, the attack waged against empathy today has a logic behind it. It's the logic of separatism, of supremacism as well. That's the kind of fragmentation that our world today is suffering from. And you just said this. The idea is to eliminate relations. The forces attacking us are doing away with relations, doing away with the way in which cultures open up to one another. According to the old humanist words, while a culture is human, it can't be foreign. We are fabricating differences and strangeness, and societies are working in that way because certain forces find it politically advantageous to do that. And so, what's the answer? Coming back to your question about what community is, the answer is to look at what's opposing that stance, the cultural war waged by forces of the right and the far right, a cultural war in particular against the idea of empathy itself and the idea of fraternity. And we really need to oppose that and also construct that idea. Our world, above and beyond fragmentation and cultural differences, obviously we are different. We're nations. We come from different cultures. We have different languages. But the idea is that there is something that transcends those differences, and that is our common humanism, humanity, and an idea of a universal that we need to build today together. And when I say that, I'm aware that universality has a bad press. Sometimes when we say universal, we tend to say that universal is necessarily colonial, it's necessarily imperialistic, and it is precisely how colonialism took place when Europe decreed that it was naturally the region in the world that bore the responsibility of the universal, and it had to bring that idea to the rest of the world. We know that it's against that colonial imperialistic idea. And you recalled just now that my work indeed forms part of what we today call post-colonial studies. Having said that, however, I've always wondered about that way in which we throw the baby out with the bathwater, as we say, doing away with the idea of the universal under the pretext that the universal was carried by an imperialistic dominating European force. I think that what today is unacceptable is a vertical form of universalism. The idea that there's a region in the world, culture, a civilization, to use a term that has become a buzzword. The idea that there's a civilization that is a beacon in this world, that places the rest of the world as a satellite, placing itself in the center. That's that form of vertical universalism that comes to an end with that movement of decolonialization, political and epistemological. On the other hand, the idea that equivalent cultures placed side by side on a same level should conspire together and together forge a universal for our times, a universal that's no longer vertical, but what I say with Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the philosopher, a universal lateral or horizontal philosophy. Thinking together, it's a difficult task. It's not an object that we exhibit. It's a practice that we need to undertake together. The idea that we need to have a practice of universalization is something that I've defended in my latest work. I imagine that's why I was invited here. And I called it universalized, focusing on the verb to universalize rather than any noun, which would be the adjective of that noun, because it's a common practice thinking about a world in which we make the universal a policy. We make fraternity a policy. We oppose those forces of fragmentation, those identitarianism-based forces. Populism is unfortunately the most shared throughout the world. There's populism in the north, of course, populism based on dehumanizing the other, reporting on strangers, stigmatizing immigrants. But we find those in the south as well, those forms of populism where we see xenophobic movements developing and taking hostage of societies. So how can we carry out political fraternity? Well, the world I described, the fragmentation I spoke about, shows us that we're living in a world of general apartheid. We're all closed in our different cultures, or these forces are closing us within our identities, such as the war in South Africa. The official policy was to say that human cultures could not and should not mix. Each culture had to be in its own silo, and development was possible only in isolation, that these cultures would never and should never meet. And that generalized apartheid that we're living in is the response. Well, the response we need to bring is the same response that Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu brought to the apartheid regime. The idea encapsulated, so to say, in that wonderful word in Bantu, which is Ubuntu. And Ubuntu, that term, was promoted by Desmond Tutu and by Nelson Mandela to seek to build on the ruins of apartheid a new rainbow nation. That means making humanity together. The philosophical meaning of that concept that comes from that humanism of the Bantu language has a twofold meaning. Humans are a task and a responsibility. Human, it's not a state. It's an invitation to become what we want to become. We always have to be responsible for humanity. And the second point in that concept is achievement, that achievement of humanity of which we are the promise is only possible through reciprocity and relations, not isolated in silos. It's not the realization of the self, as Descartes, I think, said, "I think, therefore I am." So it's humanity of the other, relations with others. That's where the concept lies. And that's why I think that the best answer to the question you asked me about community was that the movement of making humanity together, succeeding in reciprocity and hospitality. Thank you very much. You're very welcome.
Bueno, como con toda la cuestión que tiene.
As is the case with everything tied to time management, we're always a little bit tight on time. We had to cut about 20 or 30 minutes from our planned dialogue, so I had asked our speakers to speak at length, and I didn't want to cut them off because I thought, as you well saw, that these two individuals brought together such interesting views, language which perhaps isn't all that well represented, and so I wanted to make sure they had the time to share these views with us. As we only have 5 minutes left, we'll have to keep it quite short, so I'm going to ask each one of you to take 3 minutes to wrap up. Let's start with our first speaker. Eliane, you spoke about an idea of humanity that goes beyond humans to our whole entire lives. And I wanted to ask you, for this Congress, for the Educating Cities, a Congress which has so many workshops and so many events, could you share a few ideas with us that you think are essential for us here today? We heard a few, obviously, in your remarks, but I'd like to ask you if you could share a few. And for you, Souleymane, you touched on a universal. You talked about the environment applied to Ubuntu, an African context, and I just wanted to ask if you could share one or two ideas that we can pick up on in our work here at Educating Cities and in our workshop, kicking off and sparking debates that we can bring to the work of the association.
Bon.
Thank you. Sure, I'd like to share a few ideas that you might be able to pick up on when we defend a re-centralization of the world. There's an idea that the legitimate real centers of the world are enclaves where nature resists, not political and economic centers where nature is destroyed. Nature, and I'm including us in nature, so as these centers of the world, well, the centers of the world are oceans, the Amazon, our tropical rainforests, these biomes that keep us alive, not Washington, Madrid, Beijing, London, or the other major global capitals. The legitimate centers of our world, of our cities, are the peripheries, are communities of resistance, places where the majority are creating solutions and technologies so we can live, not the well-heeled neighborhoods where the majorities, the rich majorities, live. So this re-centralization of the world is something that we have worked on to build communities. People didn't think it would be possible to build communities without this re-centralization. That said, I think we need to learn to lose, to leave things behind. To build communities, we need to stand ready to lose our privileges, and that's hard. Everyone wants to build community, but nobody wants to lose anything. We need to know who our enemies are. We're losing this war, and we're losing badly. So we can't be playing on the same playing field. We need to not just live, we need to know. We need to know what we don't know. We need to understand things that don't exist. And we need to remember, everyone thinks doing very little is different from doing nothing, but we can't do nothing. We need to do the little bit that we can, and we need to fight, even if we know we're going to lose. Because if we don't fight to win, we fight to live.
Yes, so since we have very little time, I'm just going to focus what I'm going to say on education. We are teachers here. And my point would be to talk about what we can do as teachers precisely to bring out that first universal, which is humanity itself. I did it on purpose to switch from French to English. I wish I could speak Spanish. It was the Pentecostal holiday a few days ago, but the miracle did not happen. So the Holy Spirit did not bring Spanish to my different languages. But what we do as teachers is very important when it comes to making people understand that first universal that humanity is. We teach languages, different languages. They could be human languages, they could be language of science. We are mainly also teaching in so-called humanities. What it means to teach languages is that we are overcoming, so to say, our fragmentation into tribes and nations to build the notion and to make that notion of one shared humanity felt. Because when you are bilingual or multilingual, when you speak another language, you are not just adding a new skill to your resume. What you are doing is experimenting, having the experience of decentering. That is to say, to understand yourself and your own language from the standpoint of a different language. The best way to understand your language is actually to know another language, because then you realize how peculiar your language, your own language is. So this experience of decentering is the experience of getting out of your own self in order to meet the other in her difference and understanding better your own identity. In other words, the education to humanity is the education to decentering and encounter, the encounter that Philippe Meirieu was talking about in the previous panel. And this is very important because it teaches us something important, and I would like to end on that quote from thinker Léopold Sédar Senghor. What it teaches us is to understand that of course we have to be proud of being different, to be proud of our difference, but that pride in our difference should never make us forget the happiness of being together. And our task, our responsibility as teachers is precisely to educate to humanity in the singular, and most of the time through the humanities in the plural that we teach. And I thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Terminamos esta.
This brings us to the end of this dialogue, but I'd like to share one idea that I think seemed quite clear to me. The idea of community is much broader, much more complex than what we usually think of as community. The world that we live in, the community we live in, interdependence, the inability to live in isolation. And one key idea I walked away with is that we don't fight to win, we fight to maintain life. So we have to fight, even if we think we're going to lose. One other key idea that stuck with me is the idea of translation. If we speak various languages, we can seek this tradition that makes us human. And there's one other idea. Building community in times of war that affects our lives isn't easy. It's plagued by conflicts. It feels contradictory. And I think that even in failure, we can build great experiences by understanding what it's like to try to build communities in places which would be attacked. Building community, as Eliane said, is a question of life. It gives us the opportunity to find ourselves, to forge universals, and I think it's essential. And that's why I want to thank both of our speakers. I would have loved to spend hours listening to each of you speak, and I'd also like to thank everybody in the room for listening.
Molt bé.